said, put your gun on the table. That's what she What?
This is me.
Where does it say? Oh. What? Yeah. I only end up on this lobby list. Since that seems to be a person for some reason here. Top row, from the surgery.
Oh.
Yeah, I didn't. It follows the walk. I have to be I think my flight's at 1:30.
Good evening, or afternoon. It gets so dark around here that I can't tell. My name is Ernesto Cortez, Jr. I'm on the national staff of the Industrial Areas Foundation. This past fall, I've had the pleasure of being a fellow at the Institute of Politics, and for a number of you, been conducting a study group on organizing, because the study group was so wonderful and the participants so generous and attentive. There was an expression of an interest in a forum on organizing. And so I've asked several of my colleagues and associates to join me in this forum this afternoon, and hopefully by conducting this forum we can explore the dimensions of organizing and the role it plays in a free society. I think it's fitting that the Institute for Politics sponsor this kind of forum, because as we understand the work of organizing, that is, those of us who are associated with the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was founded 52 years ago by the late Saul David Linsky, it is about politics and developing people's political skills and ability. But I promised my colleagues that I would be judicious in my opening remarks, because frankly, what we want to do is have a conversation with all of you as much as possible. And so I won't talk a whole lot about what we do initially, but I do reserve the right to interrupt anybody at any time, okay? And that'll be the only rule tonight, the rule that we will operate according, is that Ernie Cortez can interrupt at any time, all right? And so forgive me, but I'll try to be as accountable and judicious in using that rule. All right. I don't want to belabor the obvious, so I'd like to introduce my colleagues and then ask each one of them to make a brief opening statement of approximately 7 minutes. I'd like my friend Marshall Gans to be our official timekeeper, okay? And do you have a watch with you? All set. Okay, so Marshall's all set. And then after they've made an additional, initial statement, of 7 minutes, then I'm going to ask all of them a question, and then I'd like to throw it open to all of you. There's 2 microphones, one over here and one over here. And frankly, like I said, we want to make this as much of a conversation as possible. This is not a workshop. Most of you know tomorrow we're going to be doing a workshop on one aspect of organizing, particularly how to do individual meetings, which will be taking place from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock at the Penthouse over in which building? The main building. Okay, so the tower. So after listening to my colleagues and getting inspired by them, hopefully a number of you will want to pursue developing your own understanding of the most important first step in building a broad-based organization. All right? Without any further ado, let me introduce all of my colleagues, and then I'm going to let Mary Beth Larkin begin. To my far right is Sister Mary Beth Larkin, who is a Sister of Social Service, but more importantly, is the lead organizer of the Paso organization, the El Paso Interreligious Sponsoring Organization in El Paso. She's been an IF organizer for 15 years, and both in Los Angeles with UNO, in Queens, the Queens Citizens Organization, with COPS, and with an organization called the Border Organization. To her immediate left is Lady Coleman Bird, who is an organizer now in Dallas with Dallas Area Interfaith, who's been an organizer in Houston with the Metropolitan Organization, and before that helped put together the sponsoring committee for what is becoming an organization in Jefferson County, Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Orange, which has the temerity to call itself the Golden Triangle. All right. I think that's right, isn't it?
That's right.
Okay.
It's the Golden Triangle.
All right, Golden Triangle. All right. And only anybody in Texas would care. But anyway, that's another story. To show we're not provincial, we've also invited Peter Fears, who is the lead organizer of a very strong organization in Phoenix, Arizona, the Valley Interfaith Organization. Peter, before being an IF organizer for the past, is it 6 years? Was an organizer for the Amalgamated Federation, no, I'm sorry, AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And he'll tell you more about that. And then to his left is Josie Mooney, who is now very active on a sponsoring committee to bring an IF organizing effort into the Bay Area, but in her real job is working for the Service Employees International Union, and Josie will tell you more about that and how she comes to be here. Without any further ado, I'd like to start off with Mary Beth, and who'll talk a little bit about what it's like to organize along the border.
Thank you. As Mr. Cortez said, I am a Roman Catholic religious. I belong to an order of women out of Los Angeles, the Sisters of Social Service. And the early days of my religious life have a lot to do with my decision to get into organizing, because I think I entered religious life at a time when I wasn't sure that that's what I wanted to do with my life, but I wanted to at least try it out. Came from a fairly religious family, and Catholicism was something that had a service edge to it and an action edge to it, and I saw religious life as an opportunity to get out and do something, and the order that I joined was into social work. But as I found myself entering religious life and getting into the work as about a 22, 23-year-old, I found myself up against a church, an institution that didn't seem to want to take me seriously. And as a young religious, working with those who I thought would be my colleagues, clergy people and others, I found myself feeling like I'm not being taken seriously. Religious, seen as handmaidens of the church, was not something that I found very attractive to how I wanted to to be as a public person. And at that point, I think I made a decision that I had to develop an edge to my own self as a public person in order to be taken seriously by my colleagues in the church as a woman and as a religious. And at the same time, I was doing social work and finding that as a social worker trying to meet the immediate needs of people, I found the needs were constant, coming at me all the time. I could be on duty in the parish 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, it seemed, and there was a constant need for people who needed help, needed service. Usually, when I called attention to the welfare department or the juvenile justice system, they would pay attention to me, but they weren't paying attention to the client that I was representing. And I felt like this isn't about just me getting taken seriously. Other people need to be taken seriously in the process. And I really came to terms with my vocation, that if I was going to stay in the church and if I was going to stay in religious life, I needed to be inside of a strategy that was about allowing people to be taken seriously. And I got into East Los Angeles about the same time that Mr. Cortez came into town to build a broad-based organization, which is now the United Neighborhoods Organization. And from that perspective, I shifted my emphasis and have since that time, 1978, been involved in full-time organizing. My career has taken me from Southern California into the New York area for several years, and since 1983, I've been in the state of Texas. My most recent experiences have been organizing churches and congregations along the Texas-Mexico border, dealing with severe problems in terms of communities that are disempowered and out of relationship with decision makers. We have 70,000 people in El Paso County, United States of America, 1990, who live without water and sewer in their neighborhoods. And much of my organizing has been around developing the political clout for those communities and those people to demand infrastructure, to demand the resources that can make their neighborhood living situations decent and a viable place to live in the future. My own interest at this point in organizing is very much around how do you develop strategies and relationships in an international environment. El Paso, Texas is really an international city of close to 3 million people. That includes El Paso County and Ciudad Juarez, the largest border community on the US-Mexico border. The problems of our communities are similar: water, sewer, air quality, infrastructure. And in order to be able to resolve those problems, we've got to work out ways that the communities can work together, the governments can be dealt with not as distinct entities, but as realities that impact the lives of people on both sides of the border. And my last 7 years of organizing has been focusing in and around how do we develop an international strategy for this kind of work.
I'm Lady Coleman Bird, and I originally am from a small town 100 miles east of Houston named Port Arthur. Port Arthur is built on the petrochemical industry, and as the petrochemical industry began to cut jobs back, we began to see a severe decline in the economy in Port Arthur. I really got angry and frustrated because as we were losing jobs, it seemed that the city council made everything black-white issues. And I wanted to do something in terms of how do you affect jobs and people's living conditions, and I thought that those things went beyond race, that there had to be a way to connect people across denominational lines, but also across racial lines so that we could work together to improve the community. I got involved in the sponsoring committee that was being put together in Port Arthur, and I got involved because of several reasons. One was that the IEF teaches a principle that you never do for people what they could do for themselves. And I wanted to become involved in my community, but I didn't want anybody else to do something for me. There were ideas that I had that I wanted to see implemented and put in place. And I liked the idea of coming together with other people that had other ideas and working on a strategy and an agenda that would affect your community, but that you had a hands-on policy in. The other thing I liked about the organizing was the idea of collective leadership, because I really thought that there was just not one person that would be able to solve the issues that were affecting us, and that it had to be a collective group of people that could work together and strategize with each other and not look for one person to do something. And the other principle was that idea of no permanent allies but no permanent enemies, because we seem to always have the same enemies. We never could talk to people, and we never could come to any agreement around anything. And I just thought that there should be a way that people could get together on issues they agree to pleasantly disagree with each other. I started organizing as an organizer in Houston, and have since, my most recent experience is in Dallas. I work in Dallas now with Dallas Area Interfaith. And I find that Dallas in a lot of ways is like Port Arthur in that it's polarized. There's a lot of racial tension in Dallas, but that also people do not understand how to work with each other. There's a book by a man named Jim Schultz named The Accommodation, who makes a statement that I think really fits Dallas well. He says that until 1978, Dallas was operated as a city-state, and that the Citizens Council made the decisions in Dallas, and that people just naturally assumed the Citizens Council would make the decisions and they would naturally go along. The Citizens Council is a group, it's still in operation, it's a group of businessmen from throughout Dallas, and they are the power brokers of the city. Does that? Okay. As I do, and we do, and Ernie, as Mr. Cortez said, we'll be talking about teaching people how to do individual meetings tomorrow. A part of what I do in the organizing is individual meetings with people. And as I do individual meetings with people, I meet a lot of people in Dallas who are like me. They're frustrated, they're angry, they want to do something in their communities, but they don't know of a vehicle that they can work with to affect change in their neighborhoods. And so a large part of why I continue to organize is because of the teaching and the transformations that I see taking place, not only within myself, but within people in the community. Last night we had a large meeting, about 300 people, mostly African American, in neighborhoods around South Dallas and Oak Cliff, where we met with the police chief, state representatives, to talk about some of the issues that have surfaced in the community that the leaders would like to see addressed. And I think it's hard to describe the transformation that you see in people that you speak to and you talk to, and they have concerns, and then they realize that they can address either the police chief or they can address a mayor or a state representative and say, these are my issues, these are my concerns, and these are the things that we'd like to work with you with to get those things corrected.
I organize in Phoenix, Arizona, and let me just kind of describe why I organize at two levels. First of all, is anybody in here from Phoenix or familiar with Phoenix? Okay. Phoenix has, and I think it's partially because it's a fairly new part of the country and it's rapidly expanding, partially because of cheap land, partially because of peculiar politics. But Phoenix has an incredible system of apartheid. Just inside the metropolitan boundaries of the city of Phoenix, there are 39 school districts. Now, what that means is that there's no integration in Phoenix. I mean, each little school district, you don't talk about citywide busing in Phoenix. That's not an issue, because each little school district is its own little part of town. And and in the same way that as the whole what's called the Valley of the Sun has grown, it's sucked up major suburbs like Mesa and Tempe and Chandler and so forth. And in each of those areas, there becomes a racially identifiable pocket of poverty. And then new suburban areas where people from all over the country are moving in, or people from California are coming in, fleeing what they don't like in California, and bringing their money with them and buying these new suburban homes. And so you create this whole suburban politics that's interested in low taxes, private schools, private clubs, so you don't have to build parks, private security, you build walled subdivisions so that there is no public life. You know, the agenda of a suburban agenda is not one that's public. And so part of what I do is built around linking together people who are able to put together an urban politic that is able to deal with and start to create public discussion around the needs of kids, around the needs of public schools, public amenities, and so forth. But that's not why I organize. You know, I have a strong need to be creative in my life. I just like that. I like to see things created. I like to see things become different. And I learned a long time ago that no matter who it is, whether it's myself or other people whom I care about, just being right, just having a good idea, just figuring something out isn't good enough. That frankly, you have to have some power. You know, if being right about, you know, loving your kids was enough, then every community I work in would have good schools. But they don't. They can't even pass the bonds. They can't even get the taxes together to build decent schools. And so it's about the whole process of getting low and middle income people together and creating the possibility of having some power and the possibility of having that power and then being recognized by people who have power. And that's probably a second reason I organize, because I get maybe it's a perverse joy, but it's certainly a joy of seeing people with power have to start dealing with people who before were just invisible in the community. I remember one of the first neighborhoods we organized, we started with a whole series of just very small things, bringing people together and teaching them how they could get power. You know, we started in April, and there were still Christmas trees laying on the side of the road. And so we had to get them picked up, you know. And that was their first victory. But they went on and they worked out an agreement with the chief of police and negotiated with the chief of police, and then negotiated with the precinct captain. They negotiated with then they negotiated with the city council, and they got a $1.6 million community center built. And about this time, the governor starts finding out that, you know, that something's really going on. And so he does this big publicity stunt. And he wants to come into a gang-ravaged neighborhood and wants to check it out for himself. So he comes in and he's doing this big tour, but he wants to do a house meeting with some of the people who are really taking back the neighborhood, people who are really making things work, people who now have some power. Well, about 5 minutes after he was supposed to get to this house meeting, his advance people show up. And they say, we got a little problem. Number one, the governor is running about 20 minutes late. And secondly, he's got a whole team of state senators with him, so that he can't meet with you privately. And thirdly, you had asked him to do a neighborhood walk, the way you've been walking the neighborhoods to deal with gangs, and he can't do that. It's too dangerous. And so these women who originally couldn't get, and they're primarily women, who could not get Christmas trees picked up, sat down with the advance team and said, now listen, number one, if the governor's coming, he's got to apologize because he's late. Number two, we're going to meet with him. And the senators can wait outside, and we'll meet with the senators afterwards. But we need to meet with him because he's the person we want to deal with. And number three, we've been walking this neighborhood for 6 weeks now. And if he can't walk with us, we'll just go out to the press and tell him the meeting's off. Well, suddenly these people are visible. I mean, you know, they're on the governor's radar screen. He came, he apologized, he met with them, there was a wonderful meeting, he agreed to work with them, he walked the neighborhood, and then the next morning he met with a whole bunch of people and he said, I will never, ever be late with you again. You folks are not only kind, you know, you're not only compassionate, but you're militant, and I don't want to mess with you, I don't want to ever get on your bad side again. But that was, for me, that was real satisfying. Let me just make one other point that for me is important in this journey, and that is that Mary Beth talked about growing up in a religious household and what faith, how important faith is. But interestingly, I went kind of the opposite way. I grew up in a religious household. with two parents who were of religions, different religions, and each religion said the other was going to hell. People wonder why I'm not real dogmatic about religion. I mean, you know, each dogma said the other was, you know. I saw a map in Harper's the other day where one religion had done a county-by-county analysis of how many people were going to hell in Alabama. Well, my personal response to that was get real secular. So I became a labor organizer, because, you know, and I just forgot about, you know, I just don't bother me with these values. It's been important for me to come back to the Industrial Areas Foundation because number one, people's traditions and their values are important. But it's been real good for me that there are places where their values and traditions come together, and we're able to do some really exciting things. Ernie often quotes Henry Gonzalez, Congressman Henry Gonzalez, who says there's no such thing as a Republican or a Democratic traffic jam. Well, there's no such thing as an Episcopal or a Methodist, you know, kid who's dropping out of school either. I mean, these are things, or there's no such thing as you know, a Catholic or a Protestant gang-ridden neighborhood. And so it is so wonderful that we've been able to do this kind of value connection.
All right. We're going to have more from Mr. Fears and the other people, but I first want to give Josie Mooney an opportunity to talk.
Being here in this institution reminds me of an interaction I had with my mother when I first called up and told her that I was going to go work for a union. I grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, and for those of you who don't know Winnetka, Illinois, it's not exactly the breeding ground for a lot of union organizers. It's a pretty Anglo-Republican, upper-middle-class neighborhood, to put it mildly. So I called her up and said, well, Mom, I've got a new job. This is right out of graduate school. I was actually in a public policy program in California. And she said, well, what am I going to tell my friends? And I said, well, you can tell them anything you want. She said, well, I think I'm just going to tell them you're at Harvard with your brother. And so
20 years in graduate school, though.
right. My brother's actually still here, but I'm a ways away in California. Out of graduate school, I happened into a job actually quite by accident. I needed a job, and I had run into this community organizer, and he offered me $500 a month to become an organizer. And at the time, I didn't much understand what that meant. So I went out into neighborhoods, and I knocked on people's doors, and I talked with them about what kinds of problems they had in the neighborhood, and would organize people into house meetings and then into little neighborhood meetings and then into meetings with a local politician. And then I met Ernie in 1981, and I began to understand that something that I was doing was quite different than what was happening in the organizations that were being built in the country by the Industrial Areas Foundation. I had been organizing people around issues, around getting a stop sign or getting the bank to make a different kind of opportunity available for credit, or doing some tenant organizing. But it had never occurred to me that what organizing is really about is the growth and development of people. And I learned that in 1981 from Ernie and the other organizers at the Industrial Areas Foundation when I took their 10-day training. And I went back to San Francisco, where there was no IAF organization, and I decided that I should try and build an institutionally based organization much like the IAF had done. And after all, I had my 10 days worth of notes, and I typed them up on my typewriter in those days, and they became rather dog-eared over the next period of time. And really still what I was doing was something like the 19th copy of a video. It was not the same because I, in my gut and in my heart, did not yet grasp that fundamentally the principles of organizing have to do with bringing people together and opening up, if you will, who they are around issues of power to affect change, the kind of change that they have a vision about, a dream about, and have just not had the opportunity to express for a whole lot of different kinds of reasons. I finally began to work for the union about 10 years ago because I believe firmly that there needs to be an organizing opportunity for working people that is different than the one that we've come to now in late years in the labor movement in this country. And in 1990, I went to meet with, again, the lead organizers of the Industrial Areas Foundation and literally beg them with $40,000 in my hand to please come to San Francisco and help us build an organization that would bring together the institutions in the Bay Area to affect the kind of change and the kind of power for low and moderate income people that everything I had tried to do up to then didn't do. And I'm glad to say that 6 weeks ago we hired our organizer and we're now running off the ground. I actually believe that the principles on which the Industrial Areas Foundation organizers in the country are built are very important for those of us who continue to work in the labor movement in this country. There's no question in my mind that without a labor movement, without the opportunity for working people to organize around the principles of work, we will be in we'll have a lot of problems. Doo-doo is really what I was thinking, Melanie. That's probably a nice way of putting it. And at the same time, if all we do is organize people around their wages and their working conditions, then we will not affect the kind of change that I'm talking about. So what we're looking for in the Bay Area is to build an organization that's related to the other organizations in Texas and in Arizona and the other organizations in Los Angeles and New York, and to see if we can't bring the institution of churches and unions and other kinds of organizations together to finally achieve the kind of change. I just want to tell you one other short story. I'm a mother and I have 3 small children, and I'm also often asked the question, how do I do the work that I do and raise my children? Not long ago, I was in the grocery store with my son, who is just turned 5 years old. And we got to the produce department, and he wanted to put, he asked why, once again, we couldn't buy any grapes. And we're there, and there are lots of people putting a lot of grapes in the cart, so it was one of those teaching opportunities. And I said, well, you tell me why we don't buy grapes. And he thought for a moment, and he said, well, I think it's because the white people in South Africa don't treat the black people in South Africa right. To which I said, well, wrong boycott. But right idea. That's why I organize.
All right. I want to thank all my colleagues. Like I said earlier, I think this is an extraordinary group of people. I'd like to ask them a question or two, if you'll allow me, but I'd like for those of you who'd like to ask them questions, or me a question, or yourselves a question, okay, to feel free to either line up at the mics or get close to the mic so that, you know, when the time comes that everyone can hear you, okay? Mary Beth talked about organizing along the border and organizing to get water and sewer services to people in El Paso. And I was wondering if maybe she could connect what she's doing along the border to the other IF organizations along the border, and how, maybe how to think about this whole question of how organizations have got to think about these questions, like getting water and sewer services, as in regional context or in a more metropolitan context. Am I being clear? Mm-hmm. Do y'all understand what I'm trying to say to her? No? No. Well, my guess is that, well, from what I know, we didn't get water and sewer services for people in El Paso, or have not been able to, just by organizing people in El Paso. We had to organize people in the valley, along the border. We had to develop allies. We had to make use of and teach the people in El Paso how to network and work with the other IF organizations around the state. because you couldn't get, we couldn't be successful just with power in El Paso, okay? Am I being clear? All right.
Dallas.
Got to have Dallas and
Dallas.
Houston and other places too, okay? Because unfortunately, the state of Texas had to act in order for us to be effective getting water and sewer services, okay? And I just would like for her to take a second and talk about that so that all of you understand what I'm trying to ask her, and it doesn't come across so unclear as it did the first time. All right.
Okay, briefly, how do 70,000 low-income Mexican Americans in El Paso County capture the resources necessary to build water and sewer systems? The price tag in El Paso County is about $170 million. In the whole Texas-Mexico border, it's about $700 million. Obviously, El Paso County or the border counties do not have that kind of public dollars to help people get the basic necessities. We discovered the problem of the colonias, low-income people being sold land by greedy developers and being promised that once you move in there, we will extend water and sewer lines and other paved roads and other neighborhood necessities to you. And people would, on the American dream idea, kind of envision their piece of land and their neighborhood and their, piece of the dream, and they would buy property, only to find out that the promises about the infrastructure were lies, that the developers would take the money and run, and that they were stuck, they and their neighbors and friends, with properties and no way to provide infrastructure. People who live in these areas haul water in 50-gallon drums, maybe 30, 40 miles. It's a day's labor for some family member to provide water for their families. So what we did as we started to understand the problem was we needed to get some attention from the state of Texas. Our sister organization in Houston in 1983 had a relationship with the lieutenant governor. He was from Houston, somebody who had seen their organizing as serious to his interests, and he was talking to them in a convention of a couple of thousand people, and they asked him, would you go visit our sister organization in El Paso, and will you talk to them about water? Just so happened that the lieutenant governor at the time was looking at a state water plan for Texas to get drainage into Houston and Dallas and some of the other major cities. And in order to get the support of TMO, he agreed, I will go to El Paso and I will meet with your sister organization. So on a Sunday afternoon in 1983, Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby came to El Paso and met with 3,000 Mexican Americans from the low-income neighborhoods of El Paso, colonias, and inner city. The mayor showed up, the county judge showed up, the other public officials who had, up until that point, not wanted to recognize this group that was beginning to organize and make noise about problems in El Paso. They had to be there because the lieutenant governor was in town. And they had to publicly say, we will work along with the lieutenant governor to try to deal with this problem. It took us a number of years to organize from the lieutenant governor, other major political representatives in the state of Texas, now Governor Ann Richards, who was then the treasurer, had a relationship with some of our organizations. She was brought to El Paso. She went into the Rio Grande Valley. She made commitments. Bob Bullock made commitments, but always knowing that the commitments were not just to the local organization there in Brownsville, Texas, or there in Eagle Pass, but to a whole network of 12 organizations in Dallas, Austin, Fort Worth, Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur, knowing that the constituencies that was represented in all of those cities believed in quid pro quo. We'll work for the colonias in El Paso because we know you'll be there to work for the education that we need in Dallas County or what we need in San Antonio. And in 1989, the legislative session in the state of Texas approved $100 million in state bonds for water and sewer for the colonias of Texas. About $65 million of that first $100 million went to El Paso County. And again in 1991, we got another legislative approval of $150 million, so we have a total now of $250 million, some federal dollars that have committed to the process, and all because the organizations throughout the network have been willing to stand together on an issue like water and sewer for the colonias along the border and to demand the attention of the powers that be at the state capitol to take that issue seriously.
And I might add that for those of you who are here, because Cabinet Secretary Henry Cisneros was so impressed by the reception he got at Harvard, he went back down last Sunday to the Valley Interfaith Convention and told 4,000 cheering Valley Interfaith delegates that he was going to work very hard to get $200 million worth of federal dollars for water and sewer services to the colonias, okay? Now, he had also gone to the Paso Convention in April and made a similar commitment, not nearly as much money, and felt obligated because of the fact that he is in working relationship with all the IF organizations to make that kind of commitment. All right, I'm going to ask some questions of my other colleagues, but let me just ask some of you, do you want to ask some questions now, or you want to react? And if you do, could you all grab a microphone and say something, and then we'll kind of mix it up a little bit. Go ahead. You got the floor. Are you an attorney?
No.
You're studying to be an attorney?
Oh, well, I'm a joint degree student.
I'm sorry?
I'm a joint degree student.
Oh, but you're, part of you is studying to be an attorney.
Maybe.
Okay. All right. I just
I'll
want to know
qualify that.
that makes you suspect. All right. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, my name is John Edson, and this is my first year at the Kennedy School of Government, and I'm from the Bay Area, and I would like to someday go back to San Jose and be an organizer there. And I had a question about the effectiveness of federal efforts with working with community programs, but I'd first like to ask, given the fact that we've got a great diversity here of panelists, unlike most of our sessions we have here at Harvard, I'd like to ask, to me...
we asked one of our other organizers, Ken Fujimoto, to come, but he couldn't, so we wanted to really make it diverse. But go ahead.
Right. Well, my question is, it seems to me from what you've all said, that once you get the community together, that they're all very creative amongst themselves, and it seems the hardest stage of the process is actually getting people together. And what I'm most interested in is the problems that a social entrepreneur, that all of you are, first faces in trying to build a sense of community. And what are the problems that someone will face in transcending racial boundaries, age boundaries, gender boundaries? Those are the kinds of things, I think, going back into a neighborhood, I would think there'd be suspicion if you're not living in that neighborhood, you're not exactly from that neighborhood. Some people I would imagine people would inherently first question your motives. And I imagine you've all had experiences like that. And to me, it seems the hardest stage in the whole process is that first step of getting people together. And I know there's a lot of my friends here who are sitting here that I know want to go back and be organizers themselves. So maybe I'm asking this for myself and for them. What's some advice that maybe each one of you can think of that we should all take to mind, things that we should avoid that to turn people, some things we could say, I would imagine, or do, would immediately turn people in the community off to us, where we may have the best of intentions, we may wind up shutting all our abilities to help. So I'll just leave it with that.
All right. That's a good question. Is that a question that some of you all are interested in? All right, okay. You want to take a quick look?
We are working in a high school in Dallas named Roosevelt, and that's an interesting question because I find that even black people, when you go into them, are suspicious of other black people. And we're doing a project in this high school. It's called peer-to-peer mentoring, but it's actually getting leaders from our churches to identify parents in the school that they can form coalitions with. And one of we did a training session with some of the people from the congregations. And one of the things that, as we practiced doing individual meetings, was one woman sat and she said, I want to go in and tell people that I'm going to help you. And immediately I said, no, 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 no. That's your first. You don't want to go to people like you have the answers and you want to help them solve their problems. I mean, we want to work with people in that community because everybody is affected by what happens in that community. And so what I said was you go in and you talk to people about your issues, but you listen to their issues and their concerns, and you work to develop a relationship with them. And that relationship means then that there's conversation. There's back and forth. There's not you going in and saying that I'm going to do this or you need this, but there's that going in and you're saying, how do you see the community? How do you see the neighborhood? And how do you see the issues in the neighborhood? But really listening to people and really being interested in what other people have to say.
Now, one of the things, before anybody else gets in, because I want to say one thing, okay. One of the things that we talk about a lot in teaching people how to do individual meetings are the art of agitation, which involves propositioning, which also involves making an offer, and conversation, okay? And I'd like for some of my colleagues to kind of talk a little bit about that. Peter, is that something you want to talk about or not? If you don't, I'll find somebody else.
I do in the context of a commitment to be broad-based.
All right, go ahead.
One of the things, not everybody can work in a community organization. I mean, that's one thing you have to be clear on up front. But the proposition that Ernie's talking about is that what an organizer has to offer is not whiteness or blackness or Spanish-speakingness or Catholicness or Unitarianness or whatever, or labor background. But what we have to offer is the capacity to teach people how to get in relationship with other people, to teach people how to create imagination, because it's not just getting people together. You have to have imagination. You have to be able to imagine how things can be different, which means some research, and it means some talking to other people. It means doing power meetings. It means all kinds of things. But there has to be some imagination that we say you can't organize what you can't imagine. Okay, so but there's also the element of learning how to be strategic and learning how to deal with power, and so those are definite skills. One of my earliest experiences as an organizer is I went into a church, and this was a small Native American church in the east part of the valley, and the parish council said, yes, we want you to come do a workshop and get us going on this is wonderful. But by the way, there's a guy who's a community activist who's in this parish, and if he walks in, we're all walking out. Being broad-based is that if you're going to really be broad-based, then you have to develop this art of conversation that Ernie's talking about. You have to understand that it's okay for people to have interests different than you. It's okay for people not to want the same thing you do. It's okay for people to be different from you. It's okay, you're not only going to work with people that you don't always agree with, but it's okay to work with people you don't even like. But that's what it means to be broad-based. Otherwise, you just build a black organization, you just build a Catholic organization, or you just build a Spanish-speaking organization, or you just, if that worked, then people would have power already, right? So, there's a purpose in being broad-based.
Joseph?
Well, seriously, I would offer, but the best advice I could offer you on that question is to show up tomorrow afternoon to this training session. Because it will radicalize how you think about your life, let alone the work. Because Lillian Hellman uses a word pentimento, which has to do with when the artist paints over the previous picture, and when the old paint becomes transparent, you can sometimes see through the old paint what the original picture was. So where there's a child now, you might see a tree. And really, one of the things I have learned is that organizing is a different way of seeing. It's learning to re-see and see what you saw originally and put it together by building relationships among and between people that traditionally otherwise wouldn't have happened. It's only in the mix of what happens between you and me that we will come up with something different that is a breakthrough for us in the course of change. I, on my own, can't do it. So that's what is so really radicalizing about the training that you might get tomorrow afternoon if you show up.
One of the things that we teach people, and it's a technical point, so I don't hate to talk about it now because we're going to deal with it tomorrow, is that you can't begin an organizing drive without a deep respect in other people. Now, what that really means is, concretely, is that you've got to give them a good story about why you're there. Therefore, you've got to be able to answer certain questions, like who are you and who sent you? Okay, or are you some sort of free agent? And if you're a free agent, how arrogant of you to come in, okay, without somebody else sending you. Now, that someone else is what we call a sponsoring committee, which Lady alluded to earlier. And one of the reasons I love the story of Moses in the Old Testament is because Moses raises all the right organizational questions, okay? When Yahweh says to Moses, you got to go out and organize my people, okay, because they're suffering, okay, he asks Yahweh a very important question. The people are going to ask me a question. By whose authority do I come in and to be their leader and be their organizer and be their agitator? They're not going to listen to me. They ran me out. And I don't want to get kicked out twice, okay? It's humiliating, all right? You do for people, you help them out, you even put your life on a line, and then they throw you out. So Yahweh says to Moses, I'll give you, okay, Moses, that's where you're going to be about it, I'll give you a sponsoring committee, okay? You tell them that the God of Abraham, and he doesn't give them an abstract concept, he personalizes it, okay? He says the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He gives them names, and he gives them a credential that they can relate to. So you don't go in by yourself, you go in with somebody that you can refer to, okay? We didn't organize in El Paso or San Antonio or Dallas or anywhere without first putting together a group of people who are respected, who are willing to support the organizing drive, okay? So it's not just Josie's $40,000 that's important, it's also the credential of that international, the credential of bishops and other religious leaders, civic leaders, social leaders. You have to build a broad-based sponsoring committee before you even begin to think about going in and organizing, okay? Because otherwise, people are going to say, well, who are you? Why do you matter? Why should I listen to you? Why are you bothering me? I'm busy enough, can't you see? Okay? You got it? And that's what I mean by respecting people's dignity, okay? Is respecting their dignity enough that you organize the right kind of credential so that it's clear to them from the get-go that you're not just going to add to their misery. We're not interested in establishing ministries of presence, okay? We're talking about agitation as a vocation. I'm sorry, Larkin, you wanted to say something? Okay. We've got some questions here.
It's somewhat academic.
I can't believe you would ask an academic question.
I can't believe it either.
All right, but go ahead, ask an academic question. We'll deign to deal with it. All right.
As a first-year student,
Who are you, by the way?
My name is Eddie Ramirez Leroy.
Okay, good to
I'm
meet you.
first year. Nice to meet you
Again.
too. Again, yeah. For first-year students, we have to take a course called 601, which is the Responsibilities of Public Action, which is essentially an ethics course. And in the course, it has been argued that we have a responsibility to preserve near-just societies by utilizing the governmental and constitutional systems that are in place. When does going through the system not enough?
Could you elaborate just a second, just a bit?
Well, it may be linked somewhat to my next question.
Which is what?
Which is that a professor here at the Kennedy School has suggested that the confrontational tactics as advocated by IAF may be contradictory to truly building long-term relationships with policymakers.
What jerk said that? Never mind, okay. Mary Beth, you want to handle that one?
The word confrontation means face-to-face. That's all it means. It means taking one another seriously. Now, 2,000 Mexican-American colonial residents in El Paso County face-to-face with the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas appears in the media as confrontational and usually gets written up in the media as confrontational. But provided that that person with whom this community wants to be face-to-face with is willing to take them seriously and to listen to what they have to say and to respond out of his own interests, but hopefully an enlightened interest, which includes the interests of others, then we can move forward. Now, what happens in initial organizing efforts, the kind of thing that happened when the mayor of El Paso would not deal face-to-face with the people of Paso, or the county judge would not deal, then the confrontations have to heat up a little. And, you know, the locked door at City Hall has to become an issue until the door gets unlocked. And people have to decide what kind of actions they need to run in order to make the face-to-face occur. And in early organizing, in our experience, particularly the organizations that began in the mid-70s, COPS in San Antonio, UNO in East Los Angeles, Paso, we had a lot of confrontation because there was not the kind of general political will that people needed to be taken seriously, and that communities had a right to organize and to begin to articulate their needs and to demonstrate their seriousness in working to get those needs addressed. We find now, as we organize in Texas and in other areas of the Southwest, the confrontations are not as tense because we have enlightened interests at all levels, government and public sector, private sector, that say, we need to talk to these people. In fact, we will be better off in conversation finding out what they want and what they expect us to do than trying to lock them out and forcing them to take action to get dealt with.
The purpose of confrontation, and Sister Mary Beth is right, confront, if you take the Latin roots, means to face with, okay? The purpose of confrontation is to make a deal, is to get something done. When I described the discussion that we had with the governor's people, it was to get something done. The irony is that most people now think of confrontation disconnected from that. In our organization, we have a sister organization in Tucson, and maybe none of you come from cultures like this, but Tucson is a lot like Austin and other university towns where there are lots and lots of activist groups. There are lots and lots of groups that are fairly loud but narrow in their, in the depth of their organization. But they all believe in confrontation, and but it's all confrontation to make noise instead of to get results. Their demonstrations or whatever. The irony is that we were told in Tucson that that of all the groups in the community in Tucson, the only one that all of them said they were using Alinsky tactics. But the only one that wasn't identified as using Alinsky tactics was the Alinsky organization, because it was broad-based. It had, the pastors were up front. They were deep in the community. They put together a plan. They did their research. They came to the mayor and said, "This is what we can do. This is what you need to do. Now, how are we going to get that done?" And so it was a very constructive process of figuring out how to solve a community problem. That's a lot different than, I don't even want to think about what.
If I could add to this,
throwing dead feet.
one of the point is that we make in teaching organizing is that you never confront for its own sake. But the only reason that you don't confront, that's not the first thing you do. The only reason that you do it is if it's necessary to change the nature of a relationship. Or another way of saying the same thing is to get somebody to deal with you. If somebody continually mistreats you, if someone is pushing you around regularly, I would assume that you would think that they're professional victims if they don't challenge the people who are mistreating them. I would think you would think that. And I would hope, therefore, that it would be clear that the point of confronting somebody is to getting them to face up to the ways in which they're operating inappropriately. But maybe not. Maybe that's not so.
And that can be done with humor, too.
Yeah, I just want to tell a story that's happening right now in San Francisco. We have a rather conservative mayor in San Francisco now who sees as one of his opportunities to get reelected to privatize the city's workforce. And in the course of that, to take $8, $10 an hour jobs, largely occupied by people of color, and make those jobs, contract them out, and give them to $4 an hour part-time, temporary, unbenefited jobs. And the union, of course, is engaged in a fight along with our allies, other institutions in the community, through our organizing efforts to defeat him. This mayor has refused to meet with us up until last week when we had a confrontation of sorts where we brought about 500 people from the community who were the beneficiaries, the clients of the service that he had eliminated from the budget. And for the first time in over a year, since the last time we beat him, it was the confrontation that made him understand that his strategy was not a winning strategy. And he called us up and said, gee, I'd like to have breakfast. I'd like to get together. I'd like to change the nature of our relationship. So that's why it is, as Ernie has said, it was useful in that case because otherwise it was going to go on, he having all the power and these folks in the community having zip. So now that relationship is altered significantly and we can come to the table with some equal power.
Who is the esteemed professor who said that? You want to embarrass him? Oh, okay. All right. Okay, real quickly, and then
Hi, my name is Andy Blauvelt. I'm a first-year student here.
you don't have to apologize for that, by the way, but go ahead.
This goes back to the question of sponsoring committees and the base on which you build the institution, and it's going to be directed primarily to Josie Mooney. But I've been taking Ernie's study group and have gone to a number of events that he's been speaking at and telling us some of these theories and talked to other students about their reactions. So one thing that people are always interested in is why congregations are the base. And I think that I have some understanding of that in that it's, you want to start with, they're one of the few institutional structures in the neighborhoods and serving the population that you want to build your organization on. They're there. San Francisco is a little bit different story. It's a very secular city, at least if you define religion as participation in organized denomination or recognized denomination. So what are you doing in that setting? How are you finding the sponsoring committee?
We are still building the sponsoring committee and bringing in institutions largely through the institution of congregations across denominational lines. But you're right, particularly in certain communities in San Francisco, largely in the Asian community. The Asian community, primarily the Chinese community as opposed to the Korean or Japanese communities, is largely unchurched. So we need to look, but to organize in San Francisco without including the Asian community would not be broad-based, and it would fly in the face of what we are about and what we're trying to build. And so we are looking for those institutions in the community that make a difference in people's lives. In most of the cases, that is people's church or their congregation. In more limited cases, unfortunately for those of us in the labor movement, it is their local. But that's increasingly less so. It might be their neighborhood or their ethnic organization or what, So we are in San Francisco are looking to a slightly different model in terms of bringing in those institutions that represent people and that share a certain value and commitment to change. So you're right, but I would still argue that unless we have the church as the basis for the organization, we will not be successful in the city. And for that reason, I've largely held back bringing in other labor locals, which I could, until the church base is very solidly built.
I wonder if our panelists might address the concept of the...
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, my name is Bill Berkowitz, and I'm here as a visitor today. I wonder if our panelists might address the idea of progress or the lack of it. Looking back over the last 10 or 20 years, do you see, or longer, do you see progress in this country toward social or economic equality? And I don't mean just in terms, I mean overall, rather than in terms of your individual successes or failures. And I wonder, too, if that's an important benchmark for you, if that's a benchmark you use in evaluating your work, or if there's some other benchmark you use in assessing whether you're doing the things you need to be doing. If it is an important benchmark, then what's it going to take to produce that social and economic equality? Is it going to be more organizers, more organizing, or is it going to be something else?
I'd like to address that after let my colleagues do that, okay? Mary Beth, you want to start?
Well, I think in some sense you could critique American society as being in worse shape than it's ever been. You know, our economy is in bad shape. There's more and more people being disenfranchised from work and, you know, from viable opportunities in terms of their economic situation. At least it is more polarized than it has been. We have two economies, kind of the high-tech, successful economy, and then low-skill, low-tech, which is becoming more and more on the downslide. And as we open up in terms of global competition, we open ourselves up to competition with low-skill, low-wage. I think, though, you got to look at it from the perspective of what's happening locally. And in the perspective of the 50-some cities in the United States where there is a tradition of church-based organizing, like the Industrial Areas Foundation has been involved in, there are literally thousands of people in neighborhoods and communities who are changing the character of decision-making within cities around a wide variety of public issues: education, healthcare, job training, and negotiating hard for their interests. I think the need to expand this kind of organizing into urban centers is critical. Certainly our agenda, as we've built 12 organizations in Texas and expanded throughout the Southwest and in the other industrial centers in the country, we are always in demand for moving into new areas, for developing organizers, and for pushing the agenda. I think there's a hunger in society. It's around values. It's around, you know, that basic sense that we've got to have a commitment to a common good. And yet, we don't teach that. There isn't a place where you can learn that apart from the experience of organizing as it's taking place in critical places around the country.
I think that when you see like the large meeting we had last night with 300 of our leaders coming together, 300 African Americans, and talking to the police chief about issues of concern to them, not only talking to him about their concerns, but saying, and these are specific things that we would like to see done in reference to those concerns, placing of mobile units, after-school programs for kids, that as I talk to people in Dallas, they do have definite ideas, and they have things that they'd like to see done. And to come and sit and talk to the police chief about something that's proactive, that's not so reactionary, where they're saying that we want to see anti-gang measures, and we think, yes, we know that we need more policing, but we need after-school programs for our children, and that they can stand up and talk to him about that, come out of that meeting, and in the evaluation say, well, we feel like we have won a victory here. Now, we haven't solved the problems, and the issues are still, but we have accomplished something in this meeting, and there is a victory here, and it's a long road in the process, but we're on our way to accomplishing it. And people are hopeful now. I mean, I've gone to people that have talked about streets that haven't been repaired in 20 years, and yet last night people came out of that meeting hopeful and really in some direction about how they'd like to see the community go.
It's an interesting question whether we're better off or worse off than we were. I think Mary Beth is absolutely right when she says that some communities are just straight worse off, that there's been a declining standard of living for some communities. And yet some communities are better off after in the last 20 years than they were 2 decades ago. Ironically, there are some places where as a country we're doing things better, and yet it's worse because it's not good enough. When we met with David Hornback, he pointed out that, who did the school restructuring in Kentucky, he pointed out that the schools are graduating more high school graduates than they ever have before. The trouble is that that's not enough. Number one, they're not educated enough when they graduate, and number two, that the changes in the economy are such that the number of kids graduating is far short. So even though we're better than we were 30 years ago or 50 years ago, it relatively we're worse off than we were because of the changes in the economy. And that, to me, is an important thing, is that there's an economist by the name of Polanyi who talks about that every change in society has cost. The important question is, who pays the cost? Is it always poor people? Well, that's why we organize, or at least that's why I do. Is because there are ways to organize so that the cost of change and the rate of change are mitigated, and so that that families and middle income and low income families don't always take a direct hit.
Well, I would just say that I believe that the most important thing that we need, those of us who are organizers now, need to be doing is to recruit and train more organizers. That unless there are talented people who do this for their life's work, that we will not be able to achieve the kind of critical mass that we have achieved in certain communities. But certainly those communities' successes pale in comparison to the national picture. But if we could build these kinds of organizations in enough cities and train enough leaders who train other leaders, that, I believe, could affect what's happening in this country and could re-democratize the institutions that represent people. But the key in my mind to that is the recruitment of talented new organizers.
I'd like to agree with everything that they've said and make maybe 2 points before I ask other people to comment. Number one is, in the current issue of the New York Review of Books, Bob Solow has a review article from a professor at MIT of a book which he doesn't like very much, so I won't go into the book. But he makes an interesting point. He says that we've got 2 basic problems with our economy. One is the recession, and 2 is a much more fundamental structural problem, that there's radical changes taking place in technology, in the globalization of the economy, and that these changes are disrupting existing patterns of organization in the workplace and in communities, et cetera. At the same time that's happening, we're beginning to see, in our cities, an unraveling of the social fabric. Okay? In fact, one of my colleagues says that one of the problems is that the social fabric is unraveling faster than we can reweave it, all right? Which is what we're trying to do, is to reweave some sort of social fabric. So in one sense, I feel when I look around and I see the proliferation of organizations and organizers, and I see the capacity of the organizations and their sophistication and the depth of understanding, I feel very, very proud and optimistic and good. On the other hand, I think that the challenges that we're facing are daunting. So that says to me we've got to do several things. Everything that we've talked about, recruit more organizers, make our leaders more sophisticated, build bigger organizations, but also we're going to have to get some allies, okay? Because we're not just organizing against now. We're not just trying to stop, greedy developers from doing bad things. We're not just trying to stop, dangerous, intersections. We're not just trying to stop flooding. We're now trying to initiate. We're trying to initiate strategies to rebuild schools, to build job training programs, et cetera. And that requires allies. That requires a different kind of organizing, okay? And we don't have the time to go into what that means, or at least I don't at this second, but hopefully some point in time, either today or tomorrow, that conversation can take place. Yes, ma'am.
I know.
Could you tell us who you are?
Yes, my name is Diana Bender, and I'm a first-year graduate student at the Kennedy School. And I don't want to beat this church thing too much, but I'm really still grappling with it. It seems to me that in organizing around issues such as healthcare, you are going to come at some point, or you have the potential to come to a point where a very important element of your healthcare clinic, such as family planning, is in fundamental conflict with the religious values of a congregation that's there. And so my question for you is this: assuming that you have to use the congregations as your base of support, what do you do when there's a fundamental issue there that is very important to the community as a whole in terms of what the goals are, especially in reaching those people who maybe are not associated with the congregation versus the values of the congregation that are never going to agree with what you want to do?
Does anybody want to tackle that, or is that one that I got to do? Peter, go ahead.
if your purpose in building an organization is to build a clinic, then you just need to put together a health movement. If the purpose of building an organization is to create a broad-based power organization, then that's what you always teach up front. That what we're about is finding the things we can work together on, because that's going to be, that's where we can continue to build the capacity and continue to learn about politics. Now, there are going to be situations where and it's not just church-based. In Valley Interfaith, there's this Chamber of Commerce, there's a labor union. There are a couple. There are some really interesting institutions, and you've got to make a deal with each other that on some things, when we're in this room, we're going to work on the things we can work on together. And when we leave this room, you guys are going to, you're going to be out at the legislature, dealing with abortion, and you're going to knock heads, okay? And that happens. That happens. One of our pastors is the clerical organizer for Planned Parenthood, and then their whole group of priests who are organizing for Right to Life, and they lead, they have these demonstrations and they pass each other in the streets, but interestingly, there is kind of a civility now because they at least know each other and they work together on other things, but at the same time, we know that as an example that putting abortion aside, that in Arizona, there's just a huge number of people who don't have any health care at all because they're either not poor enough or not rich enough. They have a job, and unfortunately, that knocks them out of being able to get good health care. And so now, we've achieved a political consensus that we're going to do something about that problem. And so we can do that. And as we do it, then it surfaces leaders at Temple Solel because they're concerned about it, and at St. Catherine's, which is a parish that's primarily Mexican American, and at First Institutional, which is a National Baptist congregation, that those folks are going to work together on this, and they're going to use this issue as a laboratory to increase their capacity to do politics together, but also to grow and get a deeper understanding of how politics works.
Good.
In the meeting we had, and I keep referring to the meeting we had last night, but it was just so powerful to see 300 African Americans in an auditorium. Different congregations represented. There were Baptists, there were Church of Christ, Catholic parishes represented, but that they understand that they're not there to try and convert each other to their religious beliefs, but they're working on public business and around public issues that affect them all, and so they respect each other's differences, and they come together around those things that they know are important in terms of the community.
This is not going to totally answer the question, but let me just make one point real clear. We're building political organizations, not religious organizations, okay? And we make that very clear from the beginning, that these are political organizations. Therefore, they have to abide by the rules of politics, okay? They may be congregationally based, they may be church-based because we think that values and meaning questions are relevant and important. We think that there is a faith dimension to this. But nonetheless, when we go into the public arena, we have to abide by the rules of politics. And one of the rules of politics that we teach is the importance of being unprincipled, okay? John Randall wrote an article in the American Scholar called The Importance of Being Unprincipled, okay? That there's two kinds of people who can afford to be overly principled, lunatics and dictators, okay? The rest of us have got to make accommodations. The rest of us have got to compromise. Alinsky used to say that there is one word which defines democracy, and that is compromise. In democracy and in politics, it's not enough to be right, you also got to be reasonable, which means you have to make concessions, okay? And so therefore, part of what we're trying to do in building a broad-based organization is teach people how to make concessions, how to negotiate with each other, which also brings us to another universal: there is no permanent enemies and no permanent allies, which means that you got to be able to work with somebody on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, fight like cats and dogs with them on Thursday and Friday, and then be able to to go back and work together with them again on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, okay? So that we can confront Henry Cisneros, who's my good friend, okay, and been a competent ally, but it's also an adversary, and because there are some issues where we draw the line in the sand, okay? But by the same token, and one of the, this is going to happen in other situations as well. One of the reasons why we will not organize just Roman Catholics or just missionary Baptists or just any one group is because we don't think any one group should own the organization, okay? It's interfaith. It abides by two value traditions, Judeo-Christian, but also the values of a free and open society. Democrat with a small d, Republican with a small r, which means tolerance, all that other good stuff. Okay, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name's Ross Bluestein. I'm here from, I live in Boston, and I'm here as a visitor. My sense is that most of your organizing activity centers in the cities where social institutions have been crumbling over the last quarter century. There's also been quite a large demographic shift from the cities to the suburbs, and increasingly social policy pits suburbanites against people in the city. Have you all tried to apply your organizing model to suburban situations where their social institutions are even weaker for the most part? And if not, are you thinking about it, and what have been your experiences?
In Dallas, we're starting to organize in Plano and Richardson, and but Plano, I understand, has a median income of like, I think, $68,000 a year. And so, yes, we are organizing in Dallas Area Interfaith in Plano and Richardson. In TMO and Houston, they were starting to go into the county, into Harris County, because the demographics of the county have been changing drastically. And so those two organizations, yes, I know, are going into suburban areas.
In Phoenix, we organized the valley, what's called the Valley of Sun, wall to wall, including the suburbs. And in some ways, the basic proposition is, do you think, going back to the way I started, do you think as a suburbanite you can afford, how long can you afford to maintain this apartheid? At what point does it shut down your economic development? Does it shut down your ability to have a neighborhood? Does it shut down the school system that things will just fall apart? That if you continue to maintain and put energy into keeping an apartheid system. But you have to do it around people's interest. And there are a lot of thoughtful folks in the suburbs, also people who are scared, frankly, at the rate of change, and that they become very active in an effort like this.
I would just add that.
Well, excuse me,
I'm sorry.
I'm going to have to cut
Okay.
you off because I'm being told I've got to limit the number of questions. I'm going to ask my sponsors here if I can allow, there's 3 people up, is that correct? Okay. Okay, can we go for 4 more questions? Okay, 4 more questions, all right.
Hi, Ernie. My name is Amir Soltani, and I write stories. Actually, would you like to make your comment?
No, go ahead.
No,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
We're going to let you talk.
Well, I think you're wrong on a couple of counts here. Since you're, on just a few. Okay. We're talking about such things as fear, shame, and pollution. Miss Larkin speaking about working where there's no sewer and no water. Those people are dirty, and those politicians don't want to see dirty things. You don't want to get touched by them, and the other side of it is that those dirty people make everyone afraid. And now there's another story that deals with fear and shame and values and compromise that I'd just like to sort of throw out and see what you think about it. It's the story of Genesis, where God tells Eve, don't touch the apple in this perfectly beautiful garden. Don't touch this resource, right? And Eve goes ahead and does. And boom, punished, shamed. You can't look at this, you can't be here, get out, And this is now, to me, it seems that at some level, you guys are, although in terms of getting things done on a daily basis, don't need to get into sort of huge religious issues and disputes. At some level, our values about shame and fear are at issue when one is dealing with social action. And I'm wondering what you think about those mega stories that shape society. Because a police chief in a city is pretty much a little Tyrannosaurus Rex, or, he keeps He keeps the happy people happy and he keeps the criminals away. He doesn't let them touch the happy people, you know? So you're dealing with a huge, huge thing, it seems to me.
Okay, and that may be beyond our competence. Okay, does anybody else want to say anything about that? Okay, Barbara?
My name
I
is
mean,
Barbara.
but not unimportant, but beyond our competence.
My name is Barbara Meister. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And I just wanted to get back to the discussion of recruitment of talented people, et cetera. And I mean, that's something that me, as a Kennedy School potential grad, is thinking about, but really wondering what for the four of you, what have been the issues that you had to deal with, the questions that you had to ask yourself to really prepare yourself for this job. It's not as easy as looking at a job description in a book in our career services office and says, yeah, I can do that job. I'm particularly curious as to Ms. Mooney's experiences with dealing with your mother who questioned, why are you doing this? And I would suspect she perceived that to not be a legitimate job. And I'm particularly interested in a response to someone like a Kennedy School student when he or she is facing the expectations that once we graduate we're going to be bureaucrats or future politicians or what have you. Can you sort of break down that paradigm of what an organizer is versus what other people expect you to be, particularly when you're graduating from this type of institution?
Well, let me just, I'm sure the four of us all have a different answer because, of course, in our life we all have to confront different questions based on who we are and where we came from and what set of relationships we've developed. For me, it was never a question of whether or not I was going to leave Gwinnett, Illinois. I am Gwinnett, Illinois. It's not a question of that. It's a question of why isn't everybody else have the opportunities that I had to go to a public school that offered 5 years of Chinese in high school. I mean, just as an example. So for me, I can't imagine doing a different job now because this is such an opportunity to, as Peter said earlier, to create, to imagine, to envision, to agitate. I don't have to be a certain way. I just have to learn to ask questions. And that's a wonderful opportunity to have your life be a question. The largest thing for me was to confront the fear of not knowing how to solve the problems that I run into every day. And I don't know how to do this. I seek to be better at it, and I am better at it each year. But I don't know how to do this. I mean, the gentleman's question about after 20 years of doing it, how come we're not further along, in, for example, just in my city? But it's an extraordinary opportunity to create in relationship with other creators. And I can't imagine that showing up to a desk at 9 in the morning could beat that.
There's a big difference between being, and I say this having done both, so I have to confess. There's such a big difference between being an organizer and being an executive director. What you said, whoever asked the question said something about bureaucrat. But to be an executive director of an organization. An organizer is an entrepreneur. Ed Chambers, who leads the IF, says that you never learn about organizing until you're a lead organizer. And you never learn about being a lead organizer. You never really learn it until you go into a community where there's no organization and scratch it out for yourself and will it into being. That you have the will to create something where nothing was before and to change the dynamics and the politics of a community. That's pretty exciting. It means being able to take some risk. It means, cultivating imagination. It means cultivating some skills. But I didn't have them when I started. May not now, but I think I'm further along. but it also takes a, you know, you kind of have to enjoy growing and enjoy seeing yourself grow and enjoy learning. When I decided to become an organizer for the IAF, I called everybody in the country that I knew that had an opinion about Ernie Cortez. I called people that didn't like him, and there were a few, but I called people who liked him as well. And I called a woman who is a nun in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, and I said, you know, if I take this job, what's the best and the worst of it? And she said, well, Peter, she says, I think it's the best. She says, I have never ever had a job in my life where the job description included that you have to read at least an hour a day to keep learning to keep growing, to learn about politics and theology and government but that you have to invest in yourself and that you are the project. Because as I grow, then my capacity to help other people grow increases. And so that, you know, that's what's good in it for me, but that's also kind of the attributes I think of the job, is there's that aspect to being an entrepreneur.
For me, it's been the growth and the development, the reading, the learning, but it's also been the leaders that I've met, the women that I've met that one woman was a teenage mother, and seeing her talking about her frustrations while her children were in the school district, but now watching her, looking at her in a public meeting and looking at her walking up to the mic and she's shaking and she can barely stand, but then watching something come over her as she discusses what she's doing and her concerns and the work that she's done with this project we're working with. It's the growth of the leaders and the confidence that you see as they begin to watch their neighborhoods and their communities change, and that they realize that it wasn't their pastor that did it, it wasn't somebody else that did it, but it was them that walked up, and that it was them that did something to make the changes happen.
I think what I'd say to that is that you got to have some anger. I would agree with Peter. The project is yourself. Have you got some anger about change, making things different? And have you got some humor to temper that so you don't eat yourself up?
Okay, there's three people up. I'm going to ask them to ask the questions, and then and then we're going to respond to all three questions, so that we can, because I think we're running out of time. So go ahead, ask your question, and we'll respond to all three of them at the same time.
Thanks. I'm Jeff Wilkinson. I'm the executive director of Massachusetts Senior Action Council, which is a statewide group. I'm an organizer too. But my question, I'd like to put a little plug in with this question. I'm here at the suggestion of Lou Finfer, who we work closely with, and I took the job a year and a half ago. The organization was on the ropes financially, and we've been about the process of rebuilding it in a number of ways. So the question is, what size budgets do these organizations work with, and how do you support them? And how do individual members help raise money for the organizations? The plug is that we are doing good grassroots organizing in Boston area and in other parts of the state. And I'm surprised and excited to hear that people at the Kennedy School are thinking about going into organizing. And if you'd like some internship or volunteer opportunities, I'm sitting right here after the meeting. Thank you.
My name is Mark Breslow. I'm the editor of Dollars and Cents magazine. I'm curious about IAF's own development. Having been around for a while, it's my perception anyway that, say, 10 or 15 years ago, one didn't hear much about IAF organizing, even though IAF's been around longer than the other models. That I was hearing more about some of the competing organizing institutes and models, I won't mention. But that recently I've been hearing more, and I know you've moved into more cities. I know you've moved into Philadelphia recently. And I'm just curious about if you can say anything about IAF's own kind of perhaps decline and redevelopment and what you'd attribute that to. Is it the failure of other models, do you think, or what conditions?
My name is Tamara Bliss. I'm also a visitor. My question's a little bit in line with the other one. In the past, IAF movement. Are any of you focusing at all on changing corporate behavior, not from a labor union perspective, but on thinking about the Great Boycott or any kind of activity like that, and is it any of it across cities?
Okay, let's see. Let me take part of it, and then I'm going to let my colleagues take whatever they want to take, and then we'll end. And I appreciate all of your patience. I'm going to take the one that somebody asked about growth. And I don't think I've been with the Industrial Areas Foundation since 1970. The COPS organizing effort started in 1974. That's 20 years ago, okay? For the last 20 years, there has been steady development of organizations, I think very successfully. I think the reason that you don't hear a lot about it is because, frankly, I think the news media gets bored with, writing about, the impact of broad-based organizing effort. They like to write about things which are dramatic and quick, et cetera. I think, secondly, there is a kind of a penchant for a quick fix in the society. I'm sorry? Celebrityville, okay, so that, and what we try, the organizers have historically been relatively anonymous and behind the scenes. And so there's not, quotes, big celebrities to write about, right? There are local heroes and heroines to write about. The kind of people that Lady has been talking about, the kind of people that Peter Fears has been talking about. But unfortunately, as a friend of mine who tried to write a story about us to a major magazine, which I don't want to mention, except that its name is, never mind, okay, he said, well, the editor said, well, where's the celebrity? Where's the, the star? They said, well, there aren't any. There are lots of heroes and heroines and great stories about, people developing. Well, that's boring stuff, okay? We want to hear about somebody like Michael Jackson or Jesse Jackson or somebody like that who kind of excites people or, turns them off or, the moral equivalent, I guess, of a Ross Limbaugh or whatever his name is, all right? So that's one of the problems. The budget varies. It can be $200,000 a year, $150,000 a year. In Chicago, it's going to be $1 million a year, okay? And where does the money come from? The money comes from initially it comes from organizational dues, and those got to be there. And it comes from a money campaign, and sometimes, like in Valley Interfaith, it's, families making contributions in addition to that. But it's got to be raised by the local leadership. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. I'd like to let my colleagues then have both answer the questions about, Mr. Fears was going to talk about the corporate effort, but then I'd like for the rest of you all just to say what you'd like to say to everybody here. And then we'll quit.
There are major corporate initiatives. The one that really stands out right now is an effort that's happening in Texas around job training, and particularly job training in Fort Worth, where the defense industry is laying off, but also in San Antonio and other places where there's been high unemployment, and yet the corporate community didn't even know, ironically, did not even know that there were high-skilled jobs going unfilled, because interestingly, the CEOs weren't talking to their personnel directors. There's now what's, I guess, a now kind of famous meeting in San Antonio where they brought all the corporate directors, all the corporate CEOs together, and they said, we want to launch a campaign to do thousands of jobs, high-wage jobs, and it's going to take some training dollars because we're going to train people for these jobs. And the CEO said, well, but this town doesn't have any good jobs. And this conversation started, and well, wait a minute, we've got a lot of high-wage jobs in the healthcare industry, and we're bringing in people from the Philippines, and we've got jobs over here that we can't fill, and we've got jobs over here that we're having to contract out. And before you know it, it turned out that the corporate community wasn't even talking to itself. And so they've restructured how business is done around job training in San Antonio, and in an effort to start changing the corporate culture. Interestingly, as the job training program has come together, there's been a minimum wage for those training jobs. A corporation, if they want to get the benefit of public dollars to train people, that it has to be I think in Houston now it's going to be $9 an hour. Is that right? $9 an hour. It has to be a job with a career ladder, and it has to be a job that offers health care, so that there's a living, what a theologian might call a family wage or living wage, but that there's the beginning of that jobs pay. And so that's one way of dealing with the corporate community. We're dealing with the corporate community, or beginning to, around the whole notion of expansion of baseball in Phoenix. That a lot of the hotshots think that this is going to be the thing, is to get a Major League Baseball team in there. And we're telling them that if they want to do it, that they're going to have to put together a major effort, a major guarantee of baseball revenue going into a children's trust fund that will fund things that are currently not being done, like after-school programs and summer jobs, and for kids who don't qualify for federal jobs, and summer enrichment programs. But we're forcing the community at the bar, kind of at the time that these change, again, going back to mitigating the cost of change, at the time they want to make changes to get them to start to deal differently with the community.
Thank you, Peter. We're running out of time, and I appreciate your patience, but I'd like to let each one of my colleagues have a kind of wrap-up statement. And for those of you who are interested in serious conversations about organizing as a career, we're going to be meeting at the IOP conference room from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock this evening. Lou Finfer has graciously organized some folks, but I don't think you mind other people being there. Is that correct, Lou, or do you want to just exclusively for those people you brought with you?
Sounds like do I still need my question, but I think we can open it up because we need more organizers.
All right, good. All right, good. And I'm glad you answered the question appropriately. Thank you very much. Mary Beth?
Okay, just briefly, I've appreciated the opportunity to be here. Thank you for your interest. I think, in a school such as this that promotes the importance of public policy, it's real critical to know that public policy is not about experts and research and bureaucratic structures alone. It's about the experience of people in our communities, in our cities, to the degree that the capacity for people to bring their experience to the table and have it taken seriously, we are going to have much better, more effective public policy, and we need talented people to do that kind of work, organizing. So those of you that feel so inclined, allow yourselves to be agitated and take a hard look at it.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being here, and I'd just like to say in terms of the organizing that it's hard to describe for me what it's meant for me, not only in terms of working with other people, but in terms of the growth and development for myself, and that I think that as a part, and the organizing has not made me the person I am, but it's enhanced the person I am, and it's helped me to understand a lot of the things that have happened in the community, kind of across racial lines, but then also how to start addressing those things and correcting them.
I just also want to throw in my thanks for your taking the time to be here today and to let you know that this is wonderful work, and that if you think that you're a candidate to engage in it, you should take the opportunities that are afforded to take a look at it. And secondly, if you don't think you're a candidate, there are ways that you can support the work that we do by helping us to raise money and by recruiting other people and becoming allies wherever you are. So we look forward to being in relationship with you in one way or another.
Okay, I want to remind all of you that tomorrow from 1 to 4 in the penthouse, we'll be doing the training session about individual meetings. We'll also take questions about power and self-interest and how you build a broad-based organization. I'd like to limit this evening session to people who are really seriously thinking about organizing, okay? And if those of you, there are other opportunities to talk about these questions, and we'll discuss those opportunities for those of you who can be there tomorrow. I want to thank the Forum and the Institute for Politics for allowing this event to take place. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I appreciate your time, your patience, and your humor. Thank you very much.